I remember that evening vividly, when my drunken husband humiliated me in front of our entire family. He shouted at me to look at myself, calling me an ugly, fat failure who would never amount to anything, and declared he wanted a divorce. At that moment, he had no way of knowing that his cruel words would become the trigger for his own downfall, nor could he imagine how I would confront him in ways he never expected. I was standing in the kitchen, slowly stirring the bubbling soup, a routine I had performed countless times before. The hot steam fogged my glasses, and my hands trembled slightly, not from the heat, but from something deeper, an emotion that had been growing inside me for days. Outside, I could hear the rain tapping against the windows, like a premonition of the storm about to break in my life. It seemed like any other evening on the surface. Sean and the family were in the living room, chatting and laughing, completely oblivious to how my world was quietly crumbling around me. For years, I had felt the walls of my marriage closing in on me, but in recent weeks, that feeling had reached its peak. As I stirred the soup, I caught fragments of conversation drifting from the living room, the children's laughter mixed with Sean's quick remarks, always disguising contempt as humor. My mind wasn't really there though. Instead, it wandered through years of sacrifices, of putting others first and my own dreams last. Suddenly, Sean's voice jerked me back to reality. From the living room, he called out asking if dinner was ready or if we were all going to starve waiting for me. Several people laughed at his mocking tone, and I felt my chest tighten. I pressed my lips together and turned off the stove. Gripping the ladle firmly, I fought to contain the mixture of anger and sadness welling up inside me. I didn't respond immediately. Over the years, I had learned to smile and let his cutting comments slide, all in the name of being a good wife and mother. But that night, something inside me was breaking, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. I carried the soup to the table and served everyone in silence. The family continued their conversation as if nothing was wrong. My eldest daughter Sarah noticed the tension in my face, but stayed quiet, knowing that any attempt to comfort me would only invite more of Sean's caustic comments. His words were always laced with poison, though most people brushed it off as mere sarcasm. But I was different from the others at that table. Each of his words cut into my heart like a razor-sharp blade, leaving permanent scars. After everyone was seated, Sean raised his wine glass. I recognized that eerie smile on his face, the one that always made my stomach churn. He announced he wanted to make a toast before dinner, his glass held high in the air. There was something in his eyes, a gleam I couldn't quite read, but it filled me with dread. Everyone turned their attention to him. I sat there in silence, my stomach twisting into knots, watching him intently. My mind raced, wondering what cruel performance he had planned this time. Sean was always one for theatrics, especially when he had an audience. He seemed to thrive on being the center of attention. He began by saying he had been patient for years, trying to understand. The family watched in silence as he continued. Then he declared he couldn't take it anymore. He turned to face me, his expression a mixture of contempt and false pity that I had seen too many times before. Looking straight at me, he called me an ugly, fat failure. He said he had wasted years trying to change me, but it had all been pointless. Then came the final blow, he wanted a divorce. The silence that followed his words was deafening, like all the air had been sucked out of the room. I felt my world crumbling beneath my feet, as if the floor itself had disappeared. Every pair of eyes in the room was fixed on me, but I couldn't even form a coherent thought. His words kept echoing in my mind, over and over, like a broken record. The words of ugly and of failure hit particularly hard because they were the same doubts I had whispered to myself, in front of the mirror on countless lonely nights. But hearing them spoken aloud, in front of everyone I loved, made them feel 1,000 times heavier, threatening to crush me completely. I could see Sarah, my daughter, sitting next to her grandmother, wanting desperately to say something, but she remained silent, afraid of her father's reaction. Sean wasn't finished though. He continued with that cold smile of his, asking me what was wrong. His smile never wavered as he spoke, like a predator toying with its prey. Sean kept pressing me with his questions, demanding to know if this was what I wanted, reminding me of everything he'd given me, and accusing me of ruining my own life. He declared he wouldn't carry that burden anymore, his words dripping with contempt. I couldn't speak, my hands trembling beneath the table, my throat tight with emotion. In that moment, years of suppressed feelings erupted like a volcano, rushing to the surface. But what I felt wasn't just pain, it was something deeper, something that had been dormant for far too long, finally awakening within me. I stood up from the table, feeling everyone's eyes on me. They were all waiting for me to crumble, to break down right there and then. But I didn't cry, and I didn't beg. Taking a deep breath, I looked Sean directly in the eyes for the first time in what felt like forever. "No, Sean, I have nothing to say," I replied quietly. "I don't need to defend myself against your words anymore," I continued, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. Sean's face darkened, clearly thrown off by my response. He let out a dry laugh and asked if that was all, if that was my grand reaction. I maintained my composure as I held his gaze, though inside, something was blazing to life. It was a feeling I could no longer ignore. "I don't care what you think of me anymore, Sean, or what anyone else has to say," I told him. "You've insulted me so many times I've lost count, but this is the last time." My quiet voice carried a calmness that seemed to overwhelm everyone in the room. When Sean tried to speak, I didn't give him the chance. "If you want a divorce, then let's get divorced," I continued. "But don't think it will break me. You broke me once before, but I survived. This time, I'm making my own choices, not you or anyone else. And believe me, I'm not the failure you think I am." Silence fell over the room once again. But this time was different. I no longer felt the weight of my family's stares pressing down on me. The humiliation Sean tried to force upon me simply couldn't touch me anymore. Instead, what I felt was pure liberation, like chains falling away from my soul. Sean was struck silent by the strength in my voice, unable to form a response. No one dared to speak a word. Those few minutes felt like an eternity, suspended in time. Finally, I stood up from the table with my head held high and walked toward the door. Without looking back, I stepped out into the cold night air, and in that moment, I knew something had changed forever within me. Though the path ahead would be difficult, I had taken my first step toward a different life. I had closed one door, but I was ready to open another. The next morning, I woke up in the small apartment I had secretly rented as a safeguard, following my instinct to secure a safe haven. That day I had been preparing for had finally arrived. As I slowly sat up, I felt the sunlight streaming through the blinds and the peaceful silence enveloping the space. There were no more angry voices, no critical glares, no sarcastic comments that had been my daily companions for years. This new quietness, though unfamiliar, brought me a profound sense of relief. Yet alongside that relief, I felt uncertainty creeping in. What should I do next? Which path should I take? Now that my marriage of so many years had suddenly ended, I needed to find answers to these questions. I brewed coffee, took a cup to the window, and watched the city awakening before me. My thoughts swung between confusion and hope like a pendulum. Last night had been a turning point in my life. It was the moment I had unexpectedly chosen to protect myself. But I couldn't turn away from reality. Sean wasn't just any husband. He was someone I had shared most of my life with, the father of my children. How would I face this weight, this history going forward? The vibration of my phone cut through my thoughts. Looking at the screen, I saw it was Sarah, my eldest daughter, calling. A flutter of anxiety passed through me. I could easily imagine how last night's events had shaken my family. Sarah, my daughter, had always understood the tension between her parents and tried to protect me. The phone rang, and I heard Sarah's voice on the other end, filled with both gentleness and worry. She asked where I was, saying she called the house but no one answered, and that her father was angry, telling everyone I'd left but wouldn't say where I'd gone. I took a deep breath before responding. I told her I was okay, just needed some space to clear my head and find my bearings. Though I tried to sound calm, my heart was still racing beneath my composed exterior. After a moment of silence, Sarah spoke again. She asked if this really meant divorce, her voice trembling with fear and sadness. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of her question settle over me. I didn't want to hurt my children, but I couldn't keep sacrificing myself either. Yes, Sarah, I replied with a voice both soft and firm, explaining that it was for the best, as the current situation wasn't healthy for anyone. Sarah sighed, and I could imagine the worry behind that sound. She told me she understood and wanted me to know she was on my side, no matter what. I thanked her, telling her how much that meant to me, fighting back the tears that threatened to fall. After hanging up, I felt a small but significant sense of relief. My daughter's understanding was a tiny beacon of hope in all this chaos. Still holding the phone, I steeled myself for the next step. For weeks, I'd been keeping a business card for a lawyer that an acquaintance had recommended. Though I couldn't imagine calling it first, now I knew it was time. As I dialed the number, I felt myself taking control of my life's helm for the first time in years. Despite the fear of what challenges lay ahead, I pressed forward. The voice on the other end announced, "Smith Law Office, how may I help you?" With a mixture of nervousness and determination in my voice, I introduced myself as Kate Johnson, explaining that I'd been referred by an acquaintance and needed legal advice about initiating divorce proceedings. The receptionist at the law office told me they could schedule an appointment for Thursday at 10 a.m. that week. I agreed and thanked her, then hung up the phone. Looking up at the ceiling, I realized I had finally begun what I had thought impossible. Starting divorce proceedings meant the beginning of a life I had never imagined for myself. It meant facing fears and doubts I had pushed aside for so long. As time passed that day, I left my apartment for a walk. Strolling through the neighborhood streets, I breathed in the fresh air and felt the sunlight warm my skin. There was a sense of liberation in being able to move freely without worrying about others' judgmental eyes. Though I wasn't sure what lay ahead, for the first time in years, I felt the power to make my own decisions. I stopped in front of a small bookstore. I had been so consumed with housework and raising children that I couldn't even remember the last time I'd been inside one. Following an impulse, I stepped inside. As I walked between the shelves, letting my eyes drift over the titles, one book caught my attention. It was called Rebirth: How to Rebuild Your Life from Zero. I picked up the book and smiled. Feeling this coincidence was somehow meant to be, I took it to the register and bought it. This wasn't just another self-help book. It was a declaration to myself. I was ready for rebirth. I was ready to rebuild what years of silence and compromise had broken. Back in my apartment, I sat down with the book in my hands. I felt this was the first step toward changing not just my body, but my mind and spirit too. As I read through the first few pages, I could feel the tension in my body slowly melting away. I understood this journey wouldn't be easy. There would be dark days and moments when I'd want to turn back. But I had my daughter and my newfound determination, and above all, a deep desire to prove something to myself. I wanted to prove I was more than what Sean thought of me. The divorce was only part of the battle. The real fight was with myself. It was a battle to break free from the role I had played for years and rediscover who I really was. The next day, I left Smith Law Office with a mixture of tension and relief flooding through my body. I had just signed the initial divorce papers, my hand trembling slightly as I wrote my name. It marked the beginning of a complicated journey, but also signaled that I was finally taking back control of my life. The lawyer had been very clear and direct with his words. He warned me that this wasn't just a legal process, but an emotional one, and I needed to be prepared for what was coming. His words resonated deeply within my chest, like a bell tolling for the end of one life and the beginning of another. I wasn't sure if I was truly ready for what lay ahead. Yet somehow, I knew that each step I took was bringing me closer to the woman I wanted to become, strong, free, and capable of making my own decisions. When I returned to my apartment, Sarah was waiting at the entrance. After our phone call a few days ago, my daughter had been restless, needing to make sure I was all right. The moment she saw me, she wrapped me in a tight embrace. That hug was filled with both love and worry, emotions I could feel radiating from her. Walking towards the apartment, Sarah asked how the meeting with the lawyer had gone. I let out a deep breath, feeling as if I was finally setting down a heavy burden I'd carried for years. I told her it had been difficult, but successful. I'd signed the initial papers, and there was no going back now. I looked at my daughter with a mix of fear and determination in my eyes. Sarah nodded understandingly. I could see in her eyes that while she'd always respected my strength, she worried that same strength might lead to loneliness. She told me she knew it was hard, but she was proud of me, saying she never thought I'd take this step, but here I was, braver than she'd ever imagined. Her words were wrapped in such gentleness. I felt emotions welling up inside me. My daughter's words brought healing to my wounded heart. I wasn't sure if I was brave, but I knew I couldn't continue living this way, enduring the insults and humiliation. That's enough, I said as I opened the apartment door. Inside, we settled onto the small living room sofa. Sarah watched me intently, seeming to search for the right words to say something important. She began speaking, her eyes never leaving mine, telling me she'd been thinking about something. Sarah told me I needed to take some time for myself, not just for the divorce, but for everything else too. She reminded me how I had always put everyone else first, her father, my children, and asked when was the last time I had thought about myself. I sat there in silence, her words striking a deep chord within me. My thoughts drifted back to all those years I had sacrificed myself for my family. Indeed, for so long, my life had been bound by chains of being Sean's wife, the children's mother, trying to be the perfect wife and perfect mother. I had rarely considered my own needs or desires, always pushing them aside for others. Now, facing this new chapter in my life, I wondered how I could learn to put myself first. You're right, Sarah, I finally responded after a few moments. I admitted that I had forgotten what it meant to do something for myself, and I wasn't sure where to begin. Sarah smiled at me, her face full of hope for the changes she saw beginning in me. She suggested I start small, telling me to try things that would make me happy. She encouraged me to do things I'd always wanted to do but never could, like going back to school or meeting new people. She assured me that even simple things would do, taking a class or starting to exercise, anything that would bring me joy. Now is your time, she said with conviction. I nodded, feeling her words resonate deep within me. I remembered the book Rebirth I had bought a few days ago. Though I had set it aside, overwhelmed by the weight of the divorce, I knew now was the time to pick it up. It could be my first step, the beginning of many new beginnings. That afternoon, after Sarah left, I settled into my small sofa and picked up the book. As I turned the pages, each word seemed to speak directly to me, as if written specifically for my situation. The book spoke about the importance of breaking free from the past, finding your own identity after years of living for others, and how true change begins from within. As time passed, I felt a stronger connection to these words. I realized my story wasn't set in stone. I had the power to shape my future with my own hands. But with that power came responsibility. I needed to learn how to make myself a priority. Suddenly, my phone rang. Looking at the screen, I saw it was a message from Sean. A cold shiver ran down my spine. Since that night, I had avoided any contact with Sean. I knew talking to him would only bring more pain. But this time, I felt I needed to face him. His message read that if I was planning to destroy our family, he would fight back, refusing to sign anything, asking if I knew what would happen if I continued. I closed my eyes, feeling tension course through my body once again. I knew he wouldn't stay quiet. He would use every trick to try to control me again. But I wasn't the same woman anymore. I had changed. He just hadn't realized it yet. I dialed Sean's number, knowing this confrontation was inevitable. The call connected within seconds, and I heard his voice. He asked if I was serious, demanding to know if I really thought I could make it without him. His voice dripped with contempt. I took a deep breath, remembering the words I had read in my book. I told him calmly that I wasn't going to argue with him. I explained that I had made my decision, and it couldn't be changed. I made it clear this wasn't about fighting or revenge or hurting him. I just wanted a fresh start. The other end of the line went quiet for a moment. He had never heard me speak like this before. When he finally responded, his voice still carried that cold bitterness. He accused me of deceiving myself, claiming I couldn't survive without him. His words were cold, feeling like poison. But this time, they didn't affect me. I told him that might have been true before, but things were different now. I explained that I was tired of being afraid, that I wanted my life back. I admitted I didn't know what the future held, but it had to be better than this. I made it clear he couldn't stop me. Another silence fell, and after a few seconds, Sean hung up without another word. I stared at my phone, feeling a mix of relief and sadness wash over me. It symbolized the end of something that had gone on far too long. I knew Sean would try to manipulate me again, but this time I was prepared to face it. That night, I fell asleep with a peace I hadn't known in years. I felt a strange, unfamiliar sense of calm. Though I knew there were many challenges ahead, I could see light at the end of the tunnel. That light was the hope pushing me forward. I now understood that the true journey wasn't about the divorce itself, but about rediscovering who I really was. Over the past few weeks, I had been constantly working with my lawyer, talking with Sarah, and putting in the effort to rebuild my life. For the first time in years, I felt like I was taking real steps toward a different future. Yet despite my determination, there was still an unshakable anxiety in my chest. Sean had been silent since our last phone call, but that silence felt ominous to me. I knew he wasn't the type of man to back down without a fight. On a dark, stormy night, the first sign that something was wrong appeared. I was preparing a light dinner in my apartment when I noticed the lights flickering. I assumed it was just a minor power surge from the storm and continued cooking. But when the lights flickered again, anxiety began to spread through my chest. Outside, strong winds and rain pounding against the windows created an unsettling atmosphere. I turned off the kitchen stove and went to check the windows. That's when I saw something strange through the living room window. There was a car parked in front of the building. The headlights were off, and though the rain made it hard to see clearly, I knew this car hadn't been there before. I picked up my phone and called Sarah, seeking comfort in my daughter's voice. Sarah immediately sensed the tension in my silence and asked what was wrong. Trying to keep my fear under control, I told her I wasn't sure. I explained that strange things were happening, the lights were flickering, and there was an unfamiliar car parked outside. I admitted that while I might be overthinking things, I couldn't shake this uneasy feeling. Sarah responded in her usual protective tone. Sarah insisted on coming over right away, saying she didn't care about the storm. She told me she couldn't leave me alone. I shook my head, though she couldn't see me through the phone, and firmly refused her offer. I told her there was no need to go out in this weather, assuring her I was fine and it was probably just my imagination. But even as I said those words, I didn't believe them myself. After hanging up, the anxiety wouldn't leave me. I closed the curtains and moved away from the windows. As I turned off the living room lights, I heard a faint sound coming from the hallway. It was barely audible, but it felt like someone was outside my door. My heart began to pound like a drum in my chest. I moved quietly toward the door and looked through the peephole. At first, I saw nothing, but just as I was about to look away, a shadow passed in front of my door. I stumbled backward, my breathing becoming ragged. I grabbed my phone again, this time determined to call the police. As I was dialing the number, I heard something turning in the lock of my door. Panic seized me. Someone who shouldn't have a key to my apartment was trying to get in. The sound of metal scraping against metal continued awkwardly, making it clear that whoever was out there was desperately trying to force their way in. I felt an icy chill run down my spine. I ran to the kitchen and grabbed the largest knife without hesitation. With my phone in one hand, I waited for the police to answer, while clutching the knife in the other. The door continued to rattle slightly, evidence of someone testing it with force. I prepared myself for the worst. Sean's image flashed through my mind. He might be actually following through with his threats. Finally, I heard the emergency operator's voice on the other end of the line. The operator asked how they could help. With a trembling voice, I told them someone was trying to break into my apartment. I told the operator I was alone and begged them to send someone quickly. As the operator asked for more details, suddenly the sound at my lock stopped. I stood frozen, still clutching the kitchen knife in my hand. All I could hear was my own ragged breathing and the rain beating against the windows. After what felt like an eternity, I heard footsteps retreating from my door. The shadow disappeared completely, and the hallway returned to its eerie silence. The operator's voice brought me some comfort, telling me that patrol cars were on their way and instructing me to stay in a safe place and not open the door until the police arrived. I sank to the floor, still gripping the knife, my whole body trembling. Yet through my fear, I felt certain about one thing. This was no coincidence. My thoughts immediately went to Sean. He was the only one who had threatened me. Since the divorce proceedings began, he might have hired someone to intimidate me, or perhaps he had tried it himself. When the police arrived, I explained everything that had happened. They searched the area but found no trace of whoever had tried to break in. The car I had seen parked in front of the building was gone too. All that remained was the fear eating away at me. That night, I barely slept. The sound of rain, which used to soothe me, now only reminded me of how vulnerable I was. I knew I had to confront Sean more directly. This incident felt like just the beginning of something darker. The next morning, with tired eyes and my nerves still on edge, I decided to take action. I picked up my phone and called Sarah. This time, though, I wasn't calling for advice. I told her I needed her to come with me, to the lawyer's office. My voice carried a determination I hadn't felt before. I explained that this couldn't continue, that Sean had gone too far, and we needed to stop this. Sarah, hearing the strength in my voice, agreed without question. She sensed how serious things had become, and all she wanted was to protect me. Sarah told me she'd be there in 20 minutes. I hung up the phone and stared at my reflection in the mirror. The dark circles under my eyes told the story of a battle that had only just begun. But there was something else in those eyes. It was a determination to fight for my safety and freedom. Fear was no longer the cage that held me prisoner. Though I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, I had no intention of giving up easily. Several months later, I was living a life focused entirely on myself. From the day I decided to stand up to Sean and reclaim my life, I had committed myself to profound changes. These changes weren't just physical, they were emotional and spiritual transformations. During this time, I lost weight, regained my confidence, and rediscovered parts of myself I thought I had lost forever. Regular training, proper nutrition, and most importantly, the emotional work and therapy had finally freed me from wounds that had remained open for years. I was no longer the anxious woman hiding in the shadow of Sean's insults. Looking in the mirror, I could recognize myself again for the first time in years. Not only had my body changed and looked healthier, but my eyes now held a determination I'd never seen before. The day had come to finalize the divorce proceedings. I was ready. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. I knew Sean would try something, though I couldn't predict exactly what was coming. I walked into Mr. Smith's law office with my head held high. I was wearing an elegant outfit that accentuated my figure. It was something I would never have chosen in my previous life. In that outfit, I felt strong and confident. Though Sarah was there to support me, I no longer needed protection. I had learned how to protect myself. Sean was already in the conference room, and turned when he heard the door. He was speechless at the sight before him. For the first time in a long while, I noticed his gaze held a mixture of surprise and admiration. Sean, who had always maintained control, appeared shaken. He said my name softly. His voice was gentler than I had ever known it to be. His gaze followed me intently, unable to hide his surprise. He told me I looked wonderful, his voice filled with unexpected admiration. I maintained my composure, nodding slightly without letting any emotion show. "Thank you, Sean," I replied in a neutral tone as I took my seat, deliberately keeping my voice free of any sentiment. The room held a tension that hadn't been present in our previous meetings. I could feel Sean's eyes fixed on me, unable to look away. For years, he had made me feel inferior, less than worthy. But now, I no longer needed his approval or his compliments. The lawyer began reading the final agreement terms, but Sean, visibly restless, interrupted. He leaned forward, staring at me intently as he spoke in a low voice. He asked if I was really going through with this, if I was really going to divorce him. I met his gaze calmly, knowing exactly what was coming. I knew Sean's talent for manipulating situations to his advantage. But this time, I was determined not to let him. I told him yes, we were getting divorced. I reminded him we had discussed this many times, and there was no going back. My voice carried a certainty I had never felt before. Sean frowned, clearly irritated by my response. He protested that things were different now. He told me to look at myself, saying I was in the best shape of my life. He admitted he had been wrong, that he had been foolish, and claimed this whole situation had made him rethink everything. He insisted we could start over, that it wasn't too late, that he loved me. There was a desperation in his voice that I had never witnessed before. I sat there, absorbing his words, realizing I had never heard him speak like this before. Once upon a time, those words might have moved me, might have kindled a flame of hope. But things were different now. I could see clearly now that Sean's love wasn't real love at all. What he had offered wasn't love, it was a need for control. I could see that his sudden attraction to me was only because I had reclaimed the strength and confidence he had once stolen from me. Love me? I repeated, almost to myself. My tone wasn't accusatory, but rather curious. I wanted him to face the falseness of his own words. Sean nodded immediately, as if trying to erase years of pain and humiliation with that single gesture. He insisted that he hadn't realized it before, that he only understood after I was gone, and that I looked amazing now. We could start over, he claimed. As he moved closer to me, I could tell he was trying to draw me back in with his words. I stared at him steadily, feeling a mix of complicated emotions wash over me. It was a strange combination of sadness and liberation. It was clear there was nothing left between us. Nothing to revive, nothing to salvage. His silence, his insults, and his complete lack of respect couldn't be erased with empty compliments. I had learned to love myself, and that was enough. Sean, you can't erase the past with words, I said, my voice quiet but firm. I explained how for years, I had felt small and insignificant, but the person he saw before him now wasn't the result of his love or regret, it was the result of my decision to no longer need his approval or control. When Sean tried to speak, I raised my hand to stop him. I told him I didn't want to continue this anymore, that I wouldn't repeat the past, that I couldn't forget what he had done, not just once, but repeatedly insulting me, and that he shouldn't expect everything to go back to normal just because he said he loved me now. I wasn't the same person anymore. My eyes caught his. In that moment, I saw the realization dawn in his eyes that he had lost me forever. Sean lowered his gaze, his pride wounded as he understood his words had been futile. The reality that he could no longer control me hit him hard. For years, he had underestimated me, always assuming I would be within his reach. But the woman standing before him was no longer the same person. The lawyer resumed control of the proceedings and concluded the divorce. Sean sat in silence, taking time to accept the situation. Meanwhile, I felt an inner peace I hadn't experienced in a long time. Though it hadn't been easy, I knew I had finally closed this chapter. I understood that my life from now on was completely my own, belonging to no one else. As I stepped out of the law office, I felt the fresh air on my face and found myself smiling naturally. I had closed one door, but ahead lay a path to a future full of possibilities. I was no longer the broken woman under Sean's control. I was now a free woman, and that freedom was my greatest victory. The divorce was finally official, and though the journey had been filled with difficulties and uncertainties, I had finally ended this battle. More than just signing papers, what filled me with satisfaction was regaining my dignity, self-respect, and power. Sarah walked beside me, smiling proudly. She knew how hard I had worked to get here, and I could see joy in her eyes as she looked at her mother, now stronger and more confident. Sarah gently squeezed my arm, telling me how proud she was of me. She said she never thought I would make it this far, but I had overcome everything with amazing determination, becoming an inspiration to others. I smiled, though my eyes held a mixture of emotion and relief. The inner battle had been just as fierce as the outer one. But what surprised me most wasn't the end of my marriage, but how I had transformed as a woman through this process. "Thank you, Sarah," I said quietly. "It wasn't easy, but I'm so glad I made it here. Whatever comes next, I'll be okay. I'm not afraid anymore." We were relaxing at a small cafe nearby, sipping our coffee. That's when my phone vibrated on the table. It was a message from Sean. I stared at the screen for several seconds before opening it. His words were simple but filled with desperation. He apologized for his many mistakes, saying he didn't know what to do without me, begging me to reconsider. I felt a slight tremor in my hands. It wasn't fear, but the realization that he finally understood I was gone forever. Yet the pain and guilt that remained within me no longer had the power to bind me. Sarah noticed my expression and asked if it was from her father. I nodded and showed her the message. Sarah frowned as she read it. She couldn't believe Sean still hadn't given up. She said firmly that even after everything was over, he was still trying to manipulate me. She insisted that I didn't need to reply, reminding me that I owed him nothing. I paused for a moment, lost in thought. My mind wandered back to all those years spent seeking Sean's approval. I remembered how I had lost my own identity under the weight of his expectations and criticism. But that era was over now. My strength no longer depended on him or anyone else. "You're right, I don't owe him anything," I replied, my voice filled with peaceful resolution. Without hesitation, I blocked his number. Sarah smiled, and we raised our coffee cups in a toast. We weren't just celebrating the end of one cycle, but the beginning of something new. The days that followed were filled with transformation. I was no longer defined by my past or my pain. With each passing day, I began exploring new facets of myself. I rediscovered things I had forgotten I loved. I enrolled in a creative writing course I had wanted to take since I was young. The words flowed naturally, and through writing, I found a way to process my experiences and express myself. I also reconnected with old friends. These were the people Sean had pushed out of my life due to his jealousy and need for control. We spent afternoons in cafes and parks, sharing stories about life and the challenges we'd overcome. I discovered there were many women with similar experiences, and sharing our stories became a source of healing. One day, while walking through town, I ran into Deborah, an old colleague. She was someone I had worked with before marrying Sean, before giving up my career for family. Deborah recognized me, with a warm smile, and came over to say hello. She hugged me tightly, calling out my name with joy. Deborah expressed amazement at how wonderful I looked, saying it had been such a long time since we'd last met. I smiled with joy, my heart leaping at this reunion with Deborah. We sat on a nearby bench and let our conversation flow freely. I shared with her about my divorce, my transformation, and how I'd discovered a new passion for life. Deborah told me earnestly that she had always known I had great strength hidden within me. She suggested that if I considered returning to work, I could be an inspiration to many women. Her words made my heart race with excitement. Until then, I hadn't considered returning to the working world, but at that moment, I realized there was no reason not to try. "Perhaps I'll take on that challenge," I replied with a confident smile. The time had come to explore opportunities one had set aside for so long. The following weeks were thrilling for me. My creative writing course was bearing fruit, and the possibility of returning to work began to feel real. Life, which had once felt narrow and restricted, was now full of growth and possibility. One day, I received an unexpected call from Deborah. She told me she had been thinking about me. She explained that there was an open position at her company that would be perfect for me. It was a leadership role, she said, one that would perfectly match my experience and strengths. I fell silent for a moment, experiencing a mix of excitement and nervousness. Though unexpected, this opportunity filled me with hope. I thanked her with overwhelming emotion, telling her I couldn't express how much this meant to me. Then came the day of the interview. I approached it with the confidence I had built over these past few months. With my hair pulled back and wearing an elegant suit, I felt prepared for anything. I was no longer intimidated by the atmosphere. After all, I only needed to prove my own worth. The interview was a success. A few days later, Deborah informed me that I had gotten the position. When I shared the news with Sarah, she congratulated me through tears of joy. She told me she knew I could do it, that I had come such an amazing way. In that moment, I realized that life always offers chances for new beginnings. There were opportunities to rise from the ashes and find greater purpose. I was no longer the woman living in the shadow of a toxic marriage. I had become strong, resilient, with a future full of possibilities. That night, as I sat down to write in my journal, memories of everything I had overcome flooded my mind. Tears of sorrow had transformed into tears of joy. My story wasn't one of defeat, but of triumph. The journey had been long, but I understood that every step had led me toward becoming who I was meant to be. The new job not only gave me financial independence, but provided a stage for further growth. I had become a woman who no longer accepted what she didn't deserve, and that change was reflected in every aspect of my life. One afternoon, after a long day at work, Deborah invited me to a networking event. Though tired, I decided to go. I knew I needed to maintain connections and look for new opportunities. The event was held in an elegant hall downtown. When I arrived, I felt a mix of nervousness and excitement coursing through me. The venue was filled with various professionals, all engaged in conversations and sharing ideas. That's when I noticed him. A dark-haired man in refined yet casual attire was watching me from across the room. His gaze was different from Sean's cold stares. It held genuine curiosity and respect. I felt our eyes meet several times, but I kept my focus on conversing with other attendees, trying not to read too much into it. Later, as I approached the drinks table, he came over to speak with me. He apologized for the sudden introduction, admitting he couldn't help himself. He introduced himself as Eric. For a moment, I was taken aback, but I felt a comfortable sensation I hadn't experienced in years. It was an effortless, genuine connection. I returned his handshake and greeting. We talked about everything from light topics to deeper subjects. I quickly realized that Eric saw me as an equal, not as someone to be conquered like Sean had. We shared ideas and experiences while treating each other with mutual respect. As time flew by and the event drew to a close, Eric asked if I'd like to take a walk. With a gentle smile that put me at ease, he invited me for coffee. Though usually cautious, I felt somehow safe in his presence, as if he carried something that helped me forget the shadows of my past. There was something about him that helped me forget the shadows of my past. During our walk that evening, Eric opened up about his life. He shared his passion for travel and his love of photography. I shared my stories too, though I carefully avoided the most painful parts of my history with Sean. I felt no need to bring those wounds into this moment. Eric listened attentively to everything I said, never interrupting or judging. That night, I felt as if a new door was opening in my life. I sensed something better waiting on the other side of that door. As we said goodbye, Eric expressed his desire to see me again with the same gentleness he'd shown all evening. With sincere eyes, he told me he didn't want to rush things, but would love to know more about me whenever I felt ready. As I agreed, I felt a warmth in my chest I hadn't experienced in years. Yes, I'd like that, I replied. Over the next few weeks, our relationship blossomed naturally. Eric never pressured me, respected my space, and appreciated every aspect of who I was. Each time we met, I felt life offering me new possibilities. It was a form of love that began with respect, freedom, and equality. Around that time, Sean learned about Eric and me through mutual acquaintances. Though he was trying to move on with his life, he saw how I was thriving without him. The woman he had once belittled and humiliated was now beyond his reach, finding someone who truly respected her. Sean appeared at my apartment one day without warning. When I opened the door, he stood there with eyes shadowed by regret and despair. He admitted, with unmistakable sorrow in his voice, how foolish he had been and that he now understood how he had ruined everything. He confessed that he regretted what he had done to me every day. I studied his face quietly. I felt neither hatred nor bitterness, but also no pity. He had come far too late. I told him gently but firmly that whatever we had was over. I explained that it wasn't just about what he had done, I had discovered my own worth. I added that what I was looking for couldn't be found in the past. My voice remained calm and steady as I spoke these words. Sean lowered his eyes, sensing the peace in my words. He finally understood there was no going back. He had lost me forever. Not because I hated him, but because I had learned to love myself. His final words were that he wanted me to know he regretted everything. Then he turned and left. As I closed the door, I felt a definitive chapter of my life closing with it. The pain and chains Sean had tried to bind me with were gone. My life had become completely my own. A few days later, I met Eric again, and we walked along the beach in an afternoon filled with gentle light and tranquility. He looked at me, with eyes full of respect and admiration. Though I wasn't yet used to accepting such a gaze completely, I found comfort in it. Eric stopped, looked at me intently, and told me how much he loved seeing me so confident and serene. Eric told me he could see a flame within me that illuminated everything around me from the inside out. A genuine smile spread across my face, coming from deep within my heart. That flame, I replied, I lit it myself. My voice carried the pride of someone who had risen from the ashes of her past. In that moment, listening to the gentle waves lapping against the shore, I had a profound realization. More than finding new love, I had found myself. My journey with Eric was built on mutual respect and admiration, and I no longer needed to fill any emptiness inside. I was already whole and complete. Meanwhile, Sean would continue his life carrying the pain of losing something he had failed to cherish. I moved forward with deep satisfaction, having gained the most precious things: freedom, dignity, and the ability to love myself. This wasn't an ending tinged with sadness or bitterness, but one filled with hope. In this place overflowing with future possibilities, I walked in my own light, no longer hiding in anyone's shadow. As the sun set on the horizon, I held Eric's hand, feeling that my true journey was only just beginning.
If you enjoyed this story, please share your thoughts in the comments section. If you've experienced similar betrayals, we would be honored to hear your valuable insights. We'd be deeply grateful if you could like this video and share it with your friends and family. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Don't miss our next surprising story showing on your screen now. We guarantee entertainment made just for you. See you in our next video.